He had exactly $43 in his checking account, a half-eaten sandwich on the workbench, and a prototype that could change everything. Nobody knew his name. Nobody cared, and that was exactly the kind of invisibility that allowed a billionaire to steal everything he had without consequence, without witnesses, and for a time, without any prospect of being called to account. There was no drama in how it began. There was only a man alone in a concrete garage on a side street in Detroit, working through the night on an idea he refused to let go of, in a city that had once built the world's most important cars and now watched from a complicated distance as other people reinvented the machine. Ethan Cole was not waiting to be discovered. He was not performing his ambition for an audience. He was simply working, with the particular intensity of someone who has decided that the quality of the work is the only argument worth making, and who intends to make it completely. In his checking account, a half-eaten sandwich on the workbench, and a prototype that could change everything. Nobody knew his name, nobody cared, and that was exactly the kind of invisibility that allowed a billionaire to steal everything he had without consequence, without witnesses, and for a time without any hope of being caught. Ethan Cole spent 7 years building a revolutionary electric sports car in a rented garage on the outskirts of Detroit, pouring every last cent of his savings into aerodynamic curves and battery systems that no one in the industry had dared attempt at the price point he was targeting. He believed in the work. He believed the work would speak for itself. He believed that the quality of an idea, clearly demonstrated, would be enough to open doors. He was wrong about the last part, at least the first time, but when he finally walked into a room with the most powerful woman in the automotive world, she looked at him the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they haven't decided whether to keep, and 3 months later, his dream rolled off her factory floor, under a different name and a different badge. What happened next shook an entire industry to its foundation and turned a single hidden video into the most explosive corporate scandal the country had witnessed in a decade. Ethan Cole grew up the kind of kid who took things apart to understand them and could never quite figure out how to put himself back together afterward. His father had worked the assembly lines in Detroit for 30 years, union man, calloused hands, proud in that particular way, of someone who makes something real with his body every single day and finds meaning in the precision of the making. Ethan inherited that pride and added something restless and burning to it, a certainty, carried from early adolescence, that the machines his father helped build could be reinvented entirely from the ground up if someone was willing to start from first principles, rather than layering incremental improvements onto existing assumptions. He studied mechanical engineering on a partial scholarship at a state university, graduated without ceremony, and spent his 20s moving between mid-level engineering roles at firms that were always slightly too conservative to know what to do with someone who kept redesigning the systems they had already signed off on and finished. He was not easy to work with. He was not interested in being easy to work with. He was interested in being right. By the time he was 31, he had a failed relationship behind him, a daughter he was raising alone on a single income, a mortgage-sized stack of personal debt accumulated across years of modest pay and expensive ideas, and a concept that had been following him around for so long. It had started to feel like a second self, a shadow that matched his exact shape and refused to be outrun no matter how far he walked from it. The idea was this: the electric sports car did not have to be heavy. It did not have to be a compromise between performance and efficiency, between beauty and engineering rigor. With the right aerodynamic shell, a specific geometry, he had been calculating and recalculating in his spare hours for 3 years, and a rethought battery distribution system that spread the weight along the undercarriage in integrated modules, rather than centralizing it in a single housing block. You could build a vehicle that drove with the precision of the best European sports cars and could be manufactured and sold at a price that the enormous mid-market segment could act. Every major manufacturer was fighting over the ultra-premium top end of the electric vehicle market and ignoring the gap where real volume lived. Ethan had mapped that gap with the precision of someone who had been studying it obsessively. He knew the opportunity was real. He knew his solution worked technically, economically, practically. He knew it with the particular bone-deep certainty that either marks a genuine visionary or a man who has spent too many nights alone with an idea until the idea becomes the only voice he listens to. He was not especially interested in which category he fell into. He rented a garage and began to build. He lost count of the number of times he considered stopping. The calculation was always the same and always came to the same answer. The design was real, the potential was real, the gap in the market was real, and stopping because it was hard was simply not something he was going to allow himself to do. He had made a kind of private peace with the difficulty early on, had accepted that this project would cost him things. Would cost him time with his daughter, that he could not entirely recover. Would cost him the ordinary social fabric of a man in his 30s who goes to barbecues and watches games on Sunday afternoons with people who ask normal questions about normal ambitions. He had traded those things deliberately and without drama, and he did not spend much energy mourning them. What he spent his energy on was the work. The aerodynamic profile went through 11 major revisions. The door mechanism was rebuilt from scratch twice. The battery module housing the element he considered most genuinely original, the thing that no one else had solved at this weight class and this price point, required a year of concentrated problem solving before the thermal management worked consistently under simulated performance conditions. He kept meticulous records of everything, every revision, every failed test, every successful one, every dimension, every material specification, every date. He had the notary witness his portfolio twice, once at year 3 and once at year 6, when the design had reached something close to its final form, because something in him insisted on the documentation, even when it felt like a formality. He would later be grateful for that instinct, with a clarity that was difficult to fully describe. The garage was 2 blocks from his apartment on a side street, in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. A crumbling concrete box, with a single fluorescent light that buzzed whenever the humidity climbed, a rolling door that stuck at the bottom in winter, and floor dimensions barely adequate for the project he was planning. He paid $450 a month for it, which required him to sell his car, his decent television, 3 pieces of audio equipment he had owned since college, and a collection of vintage wristwatches that had belonged to his father and that he had carried with him through every apartment and every move with the careful attention of a man who does not have many things that matter and takes seriously the ones he does. He told his daughter, who was 7 at the time, and used to spending weeknights at her grandmother's while her father worked, that he was building a project. She accepted this with the equanimity of a child who had grown up watching her father's mind operate slightly ahead of his surroundings. His closest friend, a general contractor named Danny Walsh, came by the garage in the 2nd month to see what was taking shape and left with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had decided that supporting his friend unconditionally and believing in his friend's project with full confidence were 2 commitments that did not have to be identical. "Ethan," Danny said, standing in the garage doorway with his arms crossed, looking at the prototype frame Ethan had already begun fabricating from salvaged and purchased components, "I want you to know I think you're one of the smartest people I know. I also want you to know that right now you're building a supercar in a concrete box with a buzzing light and a prayer and no legal protection on any of this. What's the actual plan?" Ethan told him the plan in detail. Danny listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely trying to follow technical specifications he did not fully understand, nodded several times, and said, "I respect it. I respect it the way you respect someone who decides to climb Everest with a good attitude and a sandwich." He came back the following Saturday with a better welding torch and a 6-pack, and the conversation never had to be had again. The prototype took 4 years of nights and weekends before it reached anything close to the vision Ethan had been carrying. 3 more years of refinement followed, reworking the wind tunnel simulations he ran on his own computer, using open-source modeling software, redesigning the battery module housing twice, when the first solution created a thermal management problem he had underestimated, fabricating and testing, and tearing apart and rebuilding with the patient intensity of a man who is not working toward a deadline but toward a standard, and who will not move forward until the standard is met. He had no research budget. He had hardware store materials and salvaged automotive components, and a level of personal technical skill that was, in any honest assessment, Extraordinary, the kind of depth that accumulates only from thousands of hours of direct contact with a problem, the kind that cannot be taught in any program and cannot be rushed. What emerged by year 6 was something that even Ethan, who had lived with the concept so long he sometimes struggled to see it with fresh eyes, recognized as genuinely beautiful and genuinely original. The car sat low and long, its profile a single continuous arc from nose to tail that broke no line unnecessarily. The door mechanism opened in a sweeping upward motion that no manufacturer at this price class was using, because no one else had solved the mechanical problem of executing it at this weight and this cost. The battery modules ran in an integrated housing system along the lower chassis rail, invisible from outside, and producing handling characteristics the simulations consistently predicted would be competitive with vehicles costing 2 to 3 times the projected price point. It was, by every technical measure Ethan could apply, exactly what he had set out to build. He had not yet filed patents, the cost was significant, and the timeline was long, and there had always been something else more immediately urgent. He had a USB drive containing the complete design files, a portfolio of hand-drawn blueprints that he had dated and had witnessed by a notary at a UPS store on a Saturday afternoon, and a 3-dimensional computer model he had constructed himself. It was everything he had built and everything he believed. Then, through a chain of professional connections, a former colleague named Ryan Brecker, who knew a man named Gerald Sims, who sat on an industry advisory panel, Ethan was offered something he had not dared to expect: a single meeting with Kane Motors. He stood outside the Kane Motors headquarters on a Tuesday morning in October, wearing a suit he had purchased at a consignment shop and had altered to fit as well as it could, his portfolio under one arm and his USB drive in his jacket pocket, and looked up at the glass tower that threw the gray Michigan sky back at itself like a mirror that had decided it was more interesting than whatever it was reflecting. He had spent the previous weeks reading everything available about Victoria Kane: the magazine profiles, the case studies, the authorized biography that had been published 3 years earlier to significant commercial success. He had wanted to know exactly what he was walking into. Standing on that sidewalk looking upward, he understood for the first time the gap between reading about power and standing in its physical proximity. Then he walked through the lobby doors and told the front desk his name and was escorted to an elevator that rose 42 floors without stopping, and the doors opened onto a hallway of pale marble and clean glass, and the specific silence of an environment designed to communicate that everything here is serious, and everything here is expensive, and your presence here is entirely 22. Conditionnel. Victoria Kane had been on the cover of Fortune 3 times and Time magazine once, and in each photograph she wore the same expression, not arrogance in the way that arrogance usually registers, with its edge of insecurity and need, but something settled and complete, the calm of a person who had been the most capable individual in every room she had entered for so long that capability had stopped feeling like an accomplishment and had become simply the texture of her existence. She had built Kane Motors from her late father's struggling regional parts manufacturer into a global automotive force in under 15 years, through acquisition, through aggressive research investment, through a negotiating posture that several former business partners had described in litigation documents as comprehensively adversarial. She was 52 years old, dressed invariably in architectural black, and had a publicly articulated philosophy about innovation packaged into a widely viewed lecture and repeated in dozens of interviews that held that ideas were the cheapest resource on earth and execution was everything. She believed this. She had organized her entire professional identity around it. When Ethan Cole was escorted into her glass-walled conference room, she kept her eyes on her tablet while he was shown to his seat and acknowledged him only when she was ready, which was 90 seconds after he had entered the room. The 2 executives flanking her did not introduce themselves. The presentation was good. Ethan had rehearsed it until the technical explanation moved cleanly and the design logic was airtight. And he delivered it with the calm confidence of someone who knows the material the way only years of direct contact produce. He walked through the aerodynamic geometry, the battery distribution model, the thermal management approach, the projected manufacturing cost per unit, the market positioning. For approximately 4 minutes, Victoria Kane leaned forward incrementally, and asked 2 questions about the thermal management system that told Ethan she was genuinely engaged, questions that assumed technical sophistication that most of her counterparts would not have brought to the conversation. He answered both questions cleanly and accurately. She nodded once, a small movement that was more acknowledgement than approval. And then one of the executives leaned and said something quietly in her ear, brief, a few words, and the quality of attention in the room shifted in an instant, as completely and finally as a light being switched off. Later, Ethan would reconstruct what had been said. No patent of record, no legal team, no institutional backing. In the vocabulary of the 42nd floor, these words translated to one operational conclusion: no threat. Victoria leaned back in her chair with the unhurried ease of a woman who has made a decision and no longer needs to perform consideration. She looked at Ethan with an expression that was not quite contempt. Contempt would have required him to matter more than he did to her in that moment, and said, in a voice that was perfectly modulated and completely without emphasis, "Mr. Cole, ideas are cheap. Execution belongs to people like me." One of the executives smiled. Another had returned to his phone. Head of security appeared at the conference room door within 30 seconds, standing with the quiet expectance of someone who had been positioned nearby for exactly this moment. Ethan was escorted to the elevator without ceremony, and as the doors closed, he heard laughter from the hallway behind him, not targeted or vicious, just the ambient laughter of people who have already moved on to their next concern. He focused on his breathing on the way down. He checked his bag in the lobby from habit, the automatic reflex of a man who has learned to pay attention to small things, and saw that his USB drive was sitting at a slightly different angle than he had placed it. He was precise about objects. He always set the drive parallel to the table edge. It was now fractionally off. He stood in the lobby and held this observation still in his mind for a long moment, not yet looking at it directly. Then he walked out into the cold October air and began trying to think clearly about what it might mean. He thought about the USB drive on the train back to Detroit, and then again that night in his apartment, and then again for the next 3 weeks with the intermittent, uncomfortable frequency of a thought that has embedded itself in a place where it cannot be dislodged by reason. He had no evidence of anything. The drive could have shifted during the meeting. Objects shift. He reminded himself, repeatedly and with genuine effort, that he was not the kind of person who invented enemies because his pride had been hurt. That his dismissal from that conference room had stung in ways that could very easily distort his assessment of ambiguous details. He ran this argument against himself thoroughly and fairly. He was still left with the image of the drive sitting at a few degrees off the angle he had placed it, and the knowledge that he always placed it parallel to the edge, and the fact that Victoria Kane's assistant had been the last person standing near his laptop. He filed it away. He did the only practical thing available to him, which was to accelerate the patent application and wait. He sent 2 follow-up emails to Kane Motors in the weeks following the meeting. Both returned as automated responses from a legal compliance address he had never been given, which meant someone had added his email address to a filter before he had even left the building. He called the main number twice and was transferred to a voicemail that was never returned. He drafted a letter to the general counsel's office and did not send it because advice he had read months earlier from a legal aid attorney's public blog stayed with him. Do not make specific accusations in writing before you have documentation to support them. So he waited and filed the patent application he should have filed years earlier, contacting a patent attorney who quoted him a cost between $5,000 and $12,000 and a timeline of 18 months to several years for preliminary approval. He thanked the attorney, went home, and looked at his bank account. Then he cooked dinner for his daughter, who needed his full attention that evening, and gave it to her completely, because the Kane Motors situation would still be exactly what it was in the morning. In March, Kane Motors held their annual showcase event. Ethan watched the live stream from his kitchen. The car on the stage was called the Kane Apex 1. Victoria stood before it in a circle of white light, composed and certain. The crowd responded with genuine enthusiasm. The Apex 1 was beautiful and extraordinary and production-ready. It was also, in every structural way that mattered, the chassis geometry, The door mechanism. The battery distribution system. The aerodynamic profile, Ethan's car, wearing someone else's badge, standing in someone else's spotlight. He sat in his kitchen for a very long time after the stream ended. Then he tried to tell people what had happened. The responses were swift and almost uniformly hostile. The automotive enthusiast forum he had been a member of for 6 years removed his comparison post within 48 hours for violating guidelines against defamatory content. The responses before removal had ranged from skeptical to openly contemptuous. A minor automotive blog ran a hedging 2-paragraph piece noting the design similarities, framed as questions some observers are raising, and the comment section beneath it amplified and extended what the forum had started. Kane Motors issued a polished statement, asserting their commitment to original innovation and noting that the Apex One represented years of proprietary research and development. No one named Ethan Cole. There was no reason to. He had no legal standing, no institutional platform, no credibility in the eyes of any major publication, and no money. He was nobody, and nobody wins wars against billion-dollar corporations from a position of nothing. He sat with this knowledge in his garage at night while the fluorescent light buzzed, and then, at 6:14 on a quiet Tuesday morning, an email arrived in his inbox from an address he did not recognize. It contained 4 words and a phone number. The 4 words were, "I know what happened." He called from a payphone on Woodward Avenue, which in retrospect perhaps slightly overestimated the sophistication of anyone who might have been monitoring his communications, but felt like the right choice at the time. The man who answered had a careful, quiet voice and asked Ethan, before saying anything else, to confirm 2 specific technical details from his original design. It was a verification the man was making certain he was speaking to the actual inventor and not a journalist or a Kane Motors employee trying to identify a leak. Ethan gave both details, precise numerical specifications that had never appeared in any public posting. The line was quiet for a moment. Then, "My name is Marcus Reed. I was a senior systems engineer at Kane Motors for 11 years. And I watched them take your design." They met 3 days later in a diner in Toledo that Marcus had chosen because it had no visible parking lot cameras. Marcus was in his mid-40s, heavyset, with the worn steadiness of a man who had been managing something heavy for a long time and had decided that today was the day he set it down. He ordered coffee and barely touched it. He had been terminated 8 months earlier, he explained, 2 weeks after filing an internal ethics complaint, noting that core design elements in the Apex One development files bore what he described formally as suspicious similarities to materials received through the external investment review pipeline. The complaint had gone to the compliance officer. Within 2 weeks, Marcus was on performance review. Within a month, his credentials were restricted. The termination letter cited failure to meet performance benchmarks. He described this characterization with the tired precision of a man who had given up being angry at a specific lie and had moved on to simply documenting it. Marcus had not been naive when he took the job at Kane Motors. He had understood the culture. Large automotive companies operated with a competitiveness that was structural and pervasive, and the boundary between aggressive, competitive intelligence and outright theft of intellectual property was one that the industry's legal history demonstrated had been crossed before by more than one major manufacturer. He had accepted this as the context of his professional environment and had managed within it, filing his own concerns through proper internal channels and otherwise focusing on the engineering work that he was genuinely exceptional at. What had changed was the Apex One. The design files that appeared in the Apex One development repository in November had not existed in any form in Kane Motors' internal research archive 6 weeks earlier. He had checked. He had gone back into the version history and mapped the date of first appearance of each major design element, and every core structural innovation in the Apex One had appeared within a 40-day window following the date of Ethan Cole's external pitch meeting. The correlation was complete and required no interpretation. He had gone to the compliance officer because he believed, perhaps naively, that the existence of an internal ethics process meant that it was occasionally used for its stated purpose. The speed with which the performance review materialized after his complaint was itself the only answer the compliance process provided. He pushed a manila envelope across the table. Inside, internal development memos, project phase timelines, administrative records mapping the Apex One's development against a timeline that began in a compressed, accelerated burst exactly 6 weeks after Ethan's meeting on the 42nd floor. Standard automotive development cycles ran years. This core design phase had run months. The memos referenced an accelerated aerodynamic integration directive issued directly from Victoria's office. The technical language in several memos mirrored phrasing from Ethan's original documentation almost word for word. They changed enough to complicate a patent case, Marcus said. Exactly enough, and no more. Their IP team went through your design and identified what they could modify without destroying the core innovation. They modified precisely those elements. He paused. Outside the window, a truck moved slowly down the street, but there was a meeting, early in the development phase, small group. Victoria was there. It was recorded. If that recording still exists, he looked at Ethan directly. If it still exists, she's finished. The recording lived on a legacy archive server that Marcus had mapped during his final weeks of employment, when his access credentials were still active and his work was formally legitimate. He had not retrieved it, then had not been certain what it contained. Only uneasy about what its existence implied. Now, 8 months later, he still knew the server architecture well enough to work through channels, former colleagues, contractors with residual access, the informal network that large organizations always assume they've sealed, but never quite do. The obstacle was time. Kane Motors ran quarterly automated deletion cycles on legacy archive servers. The recording had survived 3 cycles, almost certainly because it was encrypted with an outdated legacy protocol that no one had flagged for manual review. The 4th cycle was scheduled to execute in 24 hours. Marcus worked through the night with the focused, methodical intensity of a man who had spent 11 years inside the architecture he was now navigating against the clock. The encryption yielded after 14 hours, broken with help from a trusted former colleague. At 4:17 in the morning, the file opened. The recording was a conference room meeting 8 people around a table. Victoria at the head. The image quality flat and institutional. The audio clean. Behind her, visible on the projection screen she was pointing to, schematics that Ethan recognized immediately and completely, the way you recognize something made by your own hand. She was pointing at the aerodynamic profile. Her voice was level and certain. Take his design, she said. Improve it. And make sure nobody will ever remember his name. An engineer to her left began to say something one word, possibly the start of an objection, but Victoria had already moved to the next slide. The meeting ran 40 more minutes and detailed the entire accelerated development timeline. It was explicit, comprehensive, and exactly what they needed, and it had survived 4 deletion cycles by administrative oversight, and Marcus had opened it with 22 minutes to spare. Ethan sat with what he had just watched for a long time after Marcus closed the laptop. The room was quiet, except for the distant ambient sounds of the neighborhood outside. He thought about the 7 years. He thought about his daughter asking if the car was done yet. He thought about standing in the Kane Motors lobby holding a USB drive sitting at the wrong angle and telling himself he might be imagining things. He had not been imagining things. Looking at the timestamp on the recording and comparing it to the date of his pitch meeting, the elapsed time between Victoria Kane dismissing him from the 42nd floor and Victoria Kane directing her engineers to take his design was measurable in days. He had come to her with 7 years of work, and she had made her decision in days. He sat with this for a while. Then he told Marcus he was ready. They would upload it in the morning. Ethan uploaded the video the next morning from 3 devices simultaneously with a 600-word statement stripped to facts. The dates, the meeting content, Marcus's identity and credentials, the internal memos. He sent the package to Paul Garrett at Gear and Gravel at 6 in the morning. Paul published it at 7:30. By 9 o'clock, the video had 200,000 views. By noon, 1 million. By the end of the trading day, Kane Motors stock had fallen 11%. The board issued a statement about reviewing the matter internally. The phrase, Kane Motors scandal, trended nationally before nightfall. Victoria Kane responded within 48 hours, with a television appearance that deployed 2 simultaneous attacks. The video was artificially generated using deepfake technology now capable of fooling casual observers, and Marcus Reed was a disgruntled former employee, weaponizing stolen data for personal revenge. The 50-page legal brief her team filed the same day was technically sophisticated and moved fast enough to fracture the narrative. Mainstream coverage hedged. Some commentators qualified their earlier certainty. Certified letters arrived at Ethan's address from a Manhattan law firm accusing him of defamation and unauthorized access. Marcus went quiet for 4 days. Christine Voss, the pro bono attorney who had come through the legal aid network and was both competent and honest, told Ethan plainly, without something that removed the technical ambiguity about the video's authenticity, and without it quickly, the attention window would close and the legal pressure would grind them down by attrition. Then Sandra Park's name appeared in his inbox. The days following the video's upload were among the most disorienting of Ethan's life. He had expected a reaction. He had not quite anticipated the specific character of the reaction that Victoria Kane produced. Not a retreat, not an admission, not the dignified silence of a guilty party caught in the open, but an aggressive, coordinated, technically sophisticated counterattack that moved so fast and so comprehensively that for 72 hours it genuinely worked. The deepfake allegation was clever because it was unfalsifiable in the short term. The technology existed. The question of whether any given video was authentic required expert analysis that took time. And in the time before that analysis existed, Victoria's framing occupied the space. Ethan found himself in the peculiar position of a man who possesses the truth and cannot yet prove it to the satisfaction of a public that has been given a plausible alternative. Several journalists who had been supportive in the first 24 hours added qualifications to their coverage. One outlet that had published a detailed piece comparing the design specifications to the Apex One added an editor's note expressing caution pending independent verification of the video. The legal letters from the Manhattan firm arrived daily for a week, each one cataloging a slightly different combination of alleged torts, and Christine spread them across her desk and told Ethan that the volume was the point. The firm was not necessarily going to pursue all of these claims, but generating the paper and the attendant anxiety was itself an objective. They want you exhausted and distracted and afraid, she said. Do not give them that. He tried not to. It was harder than it sounds. Sandra Park had been building her Kane Motors file for 2 years before Ethan Cole existed in her awareness. She had begun with a different company, a different set of victims, a small battery technology startup in Phoenix that had shared proprietary documentation during due diligence for a licensing deal that subsequently collapsed, and had later found technical specifications from those documents embedded in Kane Motors' internal development records. She had found 3 more cases following the same template across 9 years. Small companies and independent inventors, good ideas and inadequate legal protection, due diligence meetings, deals that fell through, internal projects that moved with suspicious speed. 4 cases, none individually provable. Ethan was the 5th, and Ethan had a video. Her reporting broke the dam. 6 former Kane Motors employees came forward with sworn statements within 2 weeks. 2 had direct knowledge of how Ethan's materials had entered the Apex One development process. 1 had been in the room the day the recording was made and confirmed its authenticity on record. A university forensic laboratory, retained by Sandra's outlet independently of any party to the case, published a 12-page technical analysis of the video's metadata, encoding characteristics, and internal timestamps, concluding unambiguously that the recording was authentic original footage with no indicators of artificial manipulation. Marcus reappeared with a fully encrypted offline backup of the internal files, a backup he had made deliberately during his final weeks of employment and had withheld until he calculated the risk of disclosure was worth what it would achieve. Christine filed it into evidence within 48 hours. 3 members of the Commerce Committee in Washington, announced a formal inquiry into intellectual property practices in the automotive sector. Kane Motors' two largest institutional investors began reducing their positions publicly. Victoria Kane's second public statement was notably shorter and measurably less assured than the first. 6 weeks later, with cameras in the hearing room and every major outlet streaming live, Ethan Cole sat at a witness table in Washington, across from the woman who had dismissed him from the 42nd floor, and told him that ideas were cheap. The morning of the hearing, Ethan woke at 4:30 and lay in the dark of his hotel room in Washington for an hour before he stopped pretending he was going to sleep anymore. He made coffee with the room's machine and sat at the desk and went through his portfolio one more time, not because he needed to, not because there was anything he could have missed in the 17 times he had reviewed it in the previous 2 weeks, but because the act of sitting with the physical documents, the hand-drawn pages with their notary stamps, and their precise dimension notations, and their dated signatures, settled something in him. These pages existed. They had existed before the Apex One existed. That was a fact, and facts have a particular quality of steadiness that intentions and arguments and even courage cannot fully replicate. He thought about the garage. He thought about the buzz of the fluorescent light. He thought about his daughter asking, "Is it done yet?" He looked at the papers in his hands and thought, "Yes, finally, yes." The hearing ran 6 hours. Victoria's legal team objected 41 times. The committee chair, a senator from Minnesota, with 12 years of commercial litigation practice before entering politics, overruled 37 of those objections with the unhurried confidence of someone who recognizes delay tactics. Ethan presented his original design portfolio. Hand-drawn. Notarized. Time-stamped 22 months before the Apex One's public debut. A forensic document expert confirmed the material's authenticity. A professor from MIT's Mechanical Engineering Department compared the Apex One's published specifications to Ethan's original drawings in a 40-minute side-by-side technical analysis that was, to anyone with engineering knowledge, completely definitive and left no interpretive space. Marcus testified in a quiet and steady voice for 90 minutes, methodical and precise, the voice of a man who had waited a long time to be accurate in a room that was required to listen. The video played in the hearing chamber on a large screen with full audio through the room's speaker system. When Victoria Kane's voice said level, certain, in her own measured cadence, take his design, improve it. Nobody will remember his name. The gallery was completely silent. The committee chair asked Victoria Kane, on the record, whether she disputed the video's authenticity. Her attorneys conferred with her for 45 seconds. She said her legal team was reviewing all relevant materials. The chair noted the response and moved on. The hearing adjourned. It had been enough. What no camera captured in any way that translated to broadcast was the quality of silence in that hearing room in the moment after the recording finished playing. It was not the silence of a crowd shocked by something unexpected. It was the silence of a room full of people who had just watched an argument end, the kind of silence that accumulates around a fact when the fact has finally been allowed to be simply and completely itself, without qualification or the noise of competing narratives. Victoria Kane sat at the witness table with her hands flat on the surface, in front of her, and her expression composed, and her eyes focused on a point slightly above the committee chair's head. The committee chair looked at her with the measured patience of a man who has heard many explanations and is no longer in a hurry to hear another one. Ethan, sitting 2 rows back with Christine beside him, and his original portfolio on his knees, found that the anger he had been carrying for the past 18 months had gone somewhere he could not immediately locate. In its place was something simpler. The recognition that the record now existed, that what had happened was now a documented fact in a public proceeding, and nobody could take that back. He had spent 7 years building something in the dark and 14 months trying to get anyone to acknowledge it was real. The record now existed. That was enough. The Kane Motors board convened 2 days later and issued a statement at 11 o'clock at night. Victoria Kane had resigned as chief executive officer to pursue other interests. Full cooperation with all government inquiries was forthcoming. It was written in the bloodless language of managed institutional collapse, and reading it, Ethan felt something quieter than triumph and more substantial than relief, the particular stillness of a man who has set down something very heavy that he had been carrying for so long, he had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. The weight was gone. The arms remembered what it felt like to be free. The offer from Meridian Automotive arrived 2 weeks after the hearing. There was one moment, the morning after the board's statement was released, when Ethan's phone rang, and it was Danny Walsh calling from Detroit at 7 in the morning. Danny had followed the entire story, had read every piece, had watched the hearing live stream from a job site on his phone, had texted Ethan intermittently throughout with the minimal, specific commentary of a man who does not waste words, saw the memos piece, solid. And then, the day before the board's announcement, they're going to crack. Now he called to say nothing more than, "I told you I respected it. I was wrong about what I meant. I meant I believed in it." Ethan thanked him and did not say much else because there was not much to say. And Danny seemed to understand that. And after a moment, Danny said he needed to get back to a job site and hung up, which was the most Danny Walsh thing that had ever happened, and which Ethan thought about for the rest of that morning with a warmth he had not expected, and that turned out to be exactly what that particular morning needed. David Harlow, the company's founder and CEO, had started his own company in his own garage 12 years earlier, and had watched the entire Kane Motors situation with what he described in his opening message as professional interest and personal fury. He wanted to license Ethan's design with full attribution, manufacture the vehicle under Ethan's name, and pay a royalty structure that Christine Voss reviewed twice before confirming it was exactly as good as it appeared. When Ethan flew to Austin and signed the agreement in April in a sunlit conference room that felt nothing like any room he had ever been in before, Harlow shook his hand and said simply, "You should have had this 7 years ago." There was nothing to add. The car that came from the partnership was called the Cole Series 1. Production vehicles began shipping before the year was out. His name on the badge, his aerodynamic geometry in every published photograph, his door mechanism opening in the exact sweeping arc that had first existed as pencil lines on graph paper in a Detroit garage, while a fluorescent light buzzed, and his friends told him he was building a dream no one would ever buy. Automotive publications across the industry called it a genuine breakthrough. Paul Garrett of Gear and Gravel wrote 3,000 words about it under a headline that read, "Ethan Cole was right." It became the most read piece in the publication's history by a factor of 20. Victoria Kane relocated to Switzerland. Kane Motors entered restructuring proceedings. Sandra Park's investigation produced a coordinated civil action by the 5 companies and inventors whose ideas had been absorbed by the same machine over 9 years. The Department of Justice review moved through its long institutional process with the deliberate pace of systems not designed for speed, and continued long after the news had moved elsewhere. Marcus Reed found work at a smaller electric vehicle manufacturer in Michigan and sent Ethan a text the week the Cole Series 1 reviews went live. "I saw. Good." That was all. It was sufficient. The legal proceedings that followed the hearing unfolded across months, in the way that legal proceedings do, slowly, with setbacks, with motions and counter-motions and filings, that the press covered in diminishing increments as the scandal's acute phase gave way to its bureaucratic aftermath. A federal grand jury was convened in December. 3 Kane Motors executives were named in the Department of Justice review. The 5 companies and inventors that Sandra Park had identified filed their coordinated civil action in January, and when the complaint was made public, it ran to 212 pages and named 11 specific incidents across 9 years. Kane Motors insurance underwriters moved to disclaim coverage for the intellectual property claims. The company's stock, which had briefly stabilized after the board's announcement, began a second decline when the scope of the civil action became clear. None of this resolved quickly. None of it resolved cleanly. Real justice, Ethan had learned, does not come with a closing shot or a moment of punctuation. It comes in increments, in filings, in depositions, in the slow accretion of documented fact against documented fact until the weight becomes undeniable. What it felt like, from the inside, was less like winning and more like the gradual, steady release of something that had been held under enormous pressure for a very long time. The Cole Series 1's first road test review appeared 6 weeks before the official production launch. Under an embargo, Meridian had managed with the precision of a company that understood the value of a controlled narrative after the chaos of the previous year. The reviewer, a veteran named Tom Breck, who had covered the automotive industry for 22 years, spent 3 days with the car on a circuit in the Texas Hill Country. His review led with a sentence the industry would quote for years. "This is the car. The electric vehicle market has been waiting for someone to be brave enough to build." He called the aerodynamic profile the most elegant production design he had seen in a decade. He ran the car through a complete performance analysis and compared it to vehicles costing between $70,000 and $120,000 more, and found that comparison unflattering for the more expensive machines in every category that mattered to a driver. He concluded by noting that the car's name was not a marketing decision, but an act of historical record. The design belonged to one person who had built it alone in a concrete garage on a side street in Detroit. Now the car bore that person's name, on every badge, in every publication, in permanent and public record. The automotive world was unambiguously better for both facts. Ethan drove back to Detroit one last time before the garage lease expired. He stood in the doorway and looked at the space, the workbench, the tool racks, the chalk dimension lines still visible on the concrete floor, the rolling door that had stuck in winter for 7 consecutive winters, the fluorescent light that buzzed whenever it rained. The prototype was gone. It had been shipped to Meridian's engineering facility and placed in a glass display case in the lobby, with a card that read, in plain serif type, "Original Design, Ethan Cole, Detroit, Michigan." But the room still held something that display cases cannot contain. The residue of years spent caring deeply about a thing in the absence of anyone who believed you should, the specific atmosphere of a space where someone has refused to stop. He did not stay long. There was nothing left to do here. He turned off the light and locked the door and drove east on the interstate as April turned the Detroit sky, the complicated color it turns in spring, not quite gold, not quite gray, something more honest than either could manage on its own. Somewhere ahead and everywhere around him, the Cole Series 1 existed under his name and moved through the world, carrying the shape of the idea he had refused to abandon, while a fluorescent light buzzed and the winter stuck the rolling door, and his friends loved him and thought he was lost. Money can buy factories. It can buy the legal apparatus that buries small people in paperwork until they run out of the will to continue. It can buy the media relationships that transform theft into innovation and transform the inventor into the aggressor. It can buy years of silence and the machinery that manufactures reasonable doubt from thin air. But it cannot manufacture the specific quality of a person who knows what they built and holds that knowledge in an empty concrete room at midnight and keeps going anyway. That is the one resource Victoria Kane could not acquire, could not replicate, and could not, in the end, take from the man she had tried to erase. The Cole Series 1 crested a hill on a Texas highway at sunrise, its aerodynamic lines clean against the early light, its battery systems running silent and exact, its doors sweeping upward in the arc that had lived first as pencil on paper on a workbench in Detroit while nobody was watching, and nobody believed it would ever matter. It was beautiful. It was his, and the world finally knew his name.